guys, welcome back. I hope that you can't hear the dryer too loud in the background. Excuse me. And if you can, hopefully it's not too offensive. Today we are going to be reading, at least part of, because it is very long, a little story, a first-person story from the back of the 5th edition Orcs and Goblins army book. Apparently it's about Azhag, so let's just get into it. Below Azhag, the great green horde advanced. As the shadow of his wyvern fell upon his troops, they looked up, gazing skyward with a mixture of awe, fear, and brute stupidity in their red eyes. On the left of the column were the mighty orc warriors of Gore's Renders, each a towering giant whose yellow tusks gleamed proudly in the sunlight. To the right were Jorg's trolls, huge blue-skinned monsters eating the miles with their long, loping strides. Behind them, stretching for mile upon mile, came goblin tribe after goblin tribe and orc mob after orc mob. The enormous bulks of stone throwers towered over the mass, each drawn by a sweating team of gobbo slaves. Spider-riding chieftains led clans of stunted forest goblins across the open plain. Black-garbed night goblins shuffled and limped along in the bright sunlight. Here and there, amid the lines, Azhag could see sweating gobbos carrying the great ball and chains of their fanatic brethren. At the head of the army rode the boar riders, controlling their surly, bristle-snouted mounts with blows and grunts. Far off in the distance, Azhag could see the long gray line of the Wolf Rider scouts who spearheaded the horde's advance into man territory. Azhag tugged on the wyvern's reins, and the great beast swooped down over the massive troops, sending panicked goblins scuttling for cover. In their midst, a few doom divers preened themselves and flapped their artificial wings, as if they wanted to leap into the air and join him. With its great banners fluttering in the chill wind, the horde was like an endless river of color, flowing across the plains of the Eastern Empire. Where it marched, the long grass was beaten flat. A long, muddy trail of desolation stretched out behind the army. Even from this height, hundreds of feet above the army, the din was immense, a hellish cacophony born from the beat of man-skinned drums, the bellowing of beasts, and the sounding of great bronze trumpets. The high-pitched voices of the goblins mingled with the deep, sullen grumbling of the orcs. The trolls emitted confused grunts and howls as the orcs leading them poked them with sharp sticks. The soft eight-legged thud of spider legs competed with the weird giggling and screaming of the cave squigs. Dozens of orc regiments sang their battle songs, each trying to drown out their neighbors' chants and make themselves heard above the din. Occasionally they would stop singing to hurl abuse at the regiments marching alongside. Mostly this was good-natured, but Azhag knew that it could easily turn vicious and nasty. It was the way of things, and he could no more change it than he could stop himself from eating when he was hungry, or cuffing his henchmen when he was annoyed. From this height, Azhag could see the different banners and remember where each unit had joined the Wa. He had not always led such a mighty force. Once he had been a simple orc boss, leading his folk against their many enemies in the troll country. That had been before he had discovered his crown in the ruins of that vast abandoned man-city, before the strange evil dreams had come to trouble his sleep, before the foul dust of ancient days had filled his soul. Even now, as he thought of it, he felt an urge to rummage through his saddlebags and look at the old rune-encrusted crown. The crown had granted him strange powers and given him a vision of conquered realms. It made him feel invincible, and it granted him great cunning. Despite this, there was something about its slumbering evil that troubled his simple soul. There were still days when he wished he had never taken it from the dead troll's horde. No, that was foolish. The crown had lifted him above the ordinary orc rut of eating and fighting and given him vision. It had shown him the path of conquest. Soon he had been leading his tribe down through Kislev. He had fought many battles with his horse warrior of the Ice Queen, and the dwarfs of the mountains. Mostly he had won, and more green-skinned followers had flocked to his banner. After battling Kislevites on the frozen lake of Tura, where stone-thrower rocks had crashed through the ice, drowning dozens of fleeing horsemen, Jorg and his trolls had emerged from the snow-crusted pine forest. After he had burned the Kislevite town of Petrograd, the Boar Riders had ridden up to take part in the plundering. I think, isn't Petrograd a real place? Once he had given their leader, Urgruk, a good kicking, they had volunteered to join the Wa. Since then, orcs and goblins had flocked to his banner from every deep forest and cave lair. Night goblins had journeyed from Red Eye Mountain, bringing cave squigs and their herders with them. Sensing the growing power of the Wa, goblin shamans had hastened to the fast-growing army. Forest goblins had joined them almost as soon as they had left the mountains. It was as if some silent call had summoned them to join this vast migration. Sometimes Azhag wondered about that. The warning horn blast from the wolf riders drew him from his reverie. He glanced towards the horizon and saw the great gray wolves were loping back toward the main bulk of the army. In the distance, he could see a dark line moving to meet his army. It looked as if another group of men had gathered to try and slow his army's progress. Good, thought Azhag. His boys would win. There would be more plunder, and word of this mighty victory would spread through the forests and hills and draw ever more warriors to his side. His great plan of conquest was advancing apace. The human army deployed quickly and efficiently, as Azhag had expected it would. The humans had chosen to fight on the edge of the plains where the grass was shorter and fields of fire were easier to maintain. On their left flank, secured by the river and its marshy banks, was a great mass of heavily armored infantry. Reiksguard, the crown's evil voice, whispered into his mind. Near them were halberdiers and a huge number of poorly armored spearmen. Peasants, hastily pressed into service, said the malignant voice. In the center of the imperial force were the knights, each heavily armed and armored and mounted on a barded horse. They had massed under the banner of the Count of Ostland, their hereditary lord. Count von Raukov himself was there. As Azhag watched, the man strung his mighty enchanted bow. On his right flank, Azhag's left, war engines were deployed, a cannon and a volley gun. Beside them, several regiments of archers. As Azhag watched, a line of Kislevite horsemen took up a skirmish position in front of the Imperial army. Even at this distance, Azhag thought he recognized their banner. The Northerners had obviously followed him, seeking vengeance for their ruined homes. Azhag turned his attention to his own force. The columns swiftly spread out into a long battle line. The poor boys held the center. Their bad-tempered mounts grunted loudly and pawed the earth impatiently, as if they could not wait to get to grips with the foe. Beside them, on either side, were the orcs, each regiment keen to get on with the fight. As Azhag watched, Gor's rangers started jeering and spitting at Naga's choppers, taunting the rival unit and telling them that they were going to be left behind in the charge. Naga's boys responded with obscene gestures and crude taunts. Azhag watched them carefully, knowing that it was possible that they might forget about the foe and come to blows among themselves if left unsupervised. On the left wing of the orc army, on a slight rise in the moor, there were the rock lobbers. Each mighty catapult arm was being hastily winched into place. Sweating orcs quickly loaded huge rocks for firing. Beside the lobbers were the great catapults of the Doom Divers. A long line of winged lunatics wound up the slope to the launchers. Some hopped and gibbered with excitement. Others rushed about, wings outstretched, making whooshing noises and pretending to be already airborne. On the brow of the ridge, one doomdiver licked his forefinger, then extended it, testing the wind. He turned and shouted something to the doomdivers behind him. Azhag assumed it was favorable because they let out a whooping cheer and began to bounce up and down on the spot excitedly. In front of the ridge were a seething mass of night goblin archers. The squinting little gobos unleashed arrow after arrow into the distance, although the range was far too great for them to hit anything. Soon their leaders had to rush among them and knock a few heads together in order to get them to stop wasting their ammunition. Massed beside the archers, next to the orcs, were all those spear-armed night goblins who could not be trusted with bows. They stood howling abuse at their archer brethren and sneakily spitting in the direction of the orcs when they thought their larger kin weren't looking. If an orc cast an eye in their direction, the gobbo who had spat hastily pointed to the next spearman in line. Here and there behind the night goblins, a few fanatics lay writhing on the ground, foaming at the mouth, their jaws working steadily on great wads of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Soon they would move from a state of torpor to one of maniacal exaltation, and then they would be ready to be unleashed against the foe. Here and there among the night goblin lines, net teams took up position. Azhag would have found them funny had he not seen the teams in action previously. The netters would quickly entangle their chosen enemy, then the clubbers would swarm over them, whacking the trapped foes with their big spiky bludgeons. Working together, the teams could deal with a foe many times their own size. To the orcs' right was a herd of cave squigs and their handlers. The massive spherical monstrosities threatened to wander off and rampage through their own lines and were restrained from doing so only by the efforts of the herders. The handlers had to work The handlers had to work frantically with their great poking forks to keep their unruly charges in line. One squig broke away and waddled towards the trolls on their right. The trolls turned their stupid, blank-eyed gaze towards it. Before its handlers could stop it, the squig scuttled over to a troll. Jaws like a man-trap closed, and the squig took a great bite out of the troll's leg. Ignoring the great hole in its body, the troll casually bludgeoned the squig to the ground with the ease of an orc swatting a fly. The squig exploded with a horrid, squelching noise. Azhag watched in fascination as the troll's flesh began to grow back. On the troll's right, almost abutting the river, were the forest goblins. Tribe after tribe lined up, clutching their weapons and pushing their leaders forward into the front rank. Azhag counted the banners. The goblins of the Gaping Maw were present, along with the Horned Skulls and the Forest Scuttlers. At each end of the line were the shamans. Grimbog, the most powerful, was mounted on a spider. He scuttled into position down by the river. His apprentice, Morglum, stood by the night goblins where the vast tides of orky energy the army would soon generate could not overwhelm him. Already Azhag could sense the power that flowed over his force. Soon the Humies would feel it too. Ahead of the army, the Wolf Riders had formed up in a thin skirmish line, ready to match the Kislevites. All in all, it was an impressive force, thought Azhag, climbing into the special padded throne on the back of his wyvern. The mighty creature surged under him. With a snap, it unfurled its huge leathery wings. Azhag felt serpentine muscles coil beneath him as the beast prepared to leap into the air. The ground pulsed on his brow, feeding him its dark energy. Soon it would be time. His plans were laid. Every orc boss and goblin chieftain had his instructions. They would carry them out to the letter or feel his wrath. The ground's prompting told him it was time for a few inspiring words before the battle. Unholy energy pulsed through him as he raised his enchanted blade high above his head and let out a loud bellow. Thousands of pairs of red eyes turned to look at him. "Right, lads," he shouted. Let's give him stinking he's a good saying too. His speech made... I'm sorry, there should be a comma here, and that really confused me for a second. His speech made, he applied his spurs to the wyvern's flanks. The great reptile lurched skyward. Exultation filled Azhag as the ground dropped away beneath him, and the rushing wind whipped his face. Soon his force had dwindled until it seemed like an army of ants. He could see the blocks and squares that were both sides' units laid out like a diagram below him. He felt godlike, omniscient, filled with power, exalted by speed and distance. He brought the wyvern round in a great spiral and forced the creature down. Left to its own devices, he did not doubt that it would flap all the way to the distant mountains. As he watched, his boys began to move forward, chanting and singing and brandishing their weapons at the foe. He felt proud, certain that the inexorable green tide would soon flow over his enemies. Curses, what was that? A great ruck had broken out between Gore's boys and Naga's. As he'd feared, the rivalry between the forces had overstepped the bounds of good sense. As the two mobs had begun to advance, they had crashed into each other, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. He swooped down till he could see the battle, frantically howling curses and imprecations at both sides equally. He saw that the renders and the choppers were both getting stuck in. Gore and Naga moved among their warriors, bashing heads together and stopping the brawl from turning into a full-scale bloodbath. Coming to a quick decision, Azhag decided that he could not wait. Much as he disliked the idea, he would have to trust the two orc bosses to settle the affair and carry on with his original plan. He had seen his boys mown down by a volley gun before and did not intend to let it happen again. His stomach lurched as the monster banked and raced towards the enemy artillery. Azhag ducked his head as a doom diver whipped past. The thing's gibbering cries filled his ears and then faded as the gobbo receded into the distance. Even as Azhag watched, it plunged into the ground next to the Imperial cannon. A moment later, a second doom diver whizzed by him and crunched right into the cannon's barrel with its head, spiking it. Hearing a crunch off to his right, Azhag glanced around. A giant boulder from the rock lobber had landed among the Imperial Knights, crushing one of them. The other mounted warriors struggled to control their rearing mounts. Azhag descended right by the volley gun. His padded saddle barely absorbed the shock of impact. Frantically, the men tried to swivel the weapon to bear. The wyvern bit one of their heads off. Blood fountained into the air. Droplets of the red stuff rained down on Azhag's cheek. He licked the blood off even as he leaned low in his saddle and chopped the other gunner down with his sword. Such was the power the blade lent him that he barely felt the shock of impact as his weapon bit into the man's flesh. Vertebrae snapped as he was cut in two. With a buffet of its wing, the wyvern sent the volley gun tumbling into the mud. The nearby human archers stood pale-faced. One coward had fainted clean away. A bold sergeant hastily bellowed orders to his men to return and fire. Azhag opened his mouth and roared with laughter. The ground pulsed, and dark knowledge filled his mind. He howled the words of the blade wind spell. A dark, glittering cloud of enchanted scimitars swept out from his hands toward the sergeant. The man desperately tried to parry the ensorcelled weapons, but there were too many of them. His friends watched horrified as he was cut to tiny pieces by the hovering swords. Sensing a shift in the winds of magic, Azhag looked over at the knights. A mounted human sorcerer sent a bolt of lightning hurtling towards the oncoming forest goblins. The gobbos howled and capered as they fried, eyes popping from their sockets. Another wizard began to gesture and point at the orc warlord. The crown instantly provided Azhag with the words of a counterspell, and he dissipated the storm of mystic energy before it had even begun to form. Azhag risked a glance at his own warriors. Seen from his position within the human line, their advance certainly looked impressive. It was as if a seething green sea swept over the plain. Already shaken by the loss of their war engines, the human line was panicky. Undaunted, the Kislevites swept out towards the wolf riders and unleashed a hail of arrows at the wolf boys. A few fell, arrows protruding from their throats and eyes. The rest turned around and fled. "Come back, you yellow-bellied scum," Azhag bellowed, but if the wolf riders heard him, they pretended not to notice. A hail of fire from one of the human archer regiments encouraged them on their way. The archers who had turned to face Azhag opened fire. With a flickering movement of his hand, the Elector Count unleashed 3 arrows from his enchanted bow. Azhag raised his magical shield to protect his face and ignored the arrows that pattered off his armor and the wyvern's scales. Suddenly, the wyvern gave out an irritated screech. Looking up, Azhag saw an arrow protruding through the thin membrane of its wings. A loud roar from the humans indicated that at least a part of their army was advancing. Spells scorched the air between the armies, but the magical influences seemed balanced, and neither side took any harm. Azhag applied the spurs once more, and the wyvern leapt skyward. From on high, he had a good vantage point for the coming struggle. The human spearmen and knights were advancing behind the screen of Kislevites. The gap between the 2 armies had almost closed. The fleeing wolf riders were blocking the charge of the boar boys. Kor and Naga had finally got their lads moving. The night goblins lurched closer to the Kislevites, and suddenly 3 screaming fanatics hurled out of their ranks. Although they had been expecting it, the speed of the attack took the Kislevites by surprise, and one fell under the impact of a massive wrecking ball. Arrows from the advancing night goblins and forest goblins fell ineffectually on the Imperial force. A huge rock landed just in front of the Reiksguard knights, sending clods of muddy earth spurting into the air. Suddenly, the Elector Count and his knights saw their opportunity as the wolf riders surged past the boar boys. The human horses moved from a canter to a charge, and the lancers swept into the boar boys, skewering several with their lances. The air around the Elector Count glittered as his enchanted blade bit deep. "Rune Fang," whispered the crown's lurking spirit. "Ancient blade from the time of thrice accursed Sigmar." The surge of hatred that passed through him when the crown mentioned Sigmar made Azhag howl. For a moment it looked as if the boar boys might hold. Their surly warhogs tried to gore the horses, and their leader, Buzak, shouted curses and threats at any lad who might retreat. But then the Rune Fang bit deep, severing Buzak's head and sending it flying. The boar boys turned and fled. Azhag cursed loudly, even as he watched the knights pursued and careered straight into Gor's renders. Over by the river, the Reiksguard infantry and the halberdiers advanced towards the forest goblins. They marched with disciplined precision, every stride in time with the beat of their great drums. At the last second, they broke into a charge and threw themselves against the forest goblins. With a crash like a steel wave breaking on an iron shore, the 2 forces clashed. Soon man and goblin were fighting beat breast to breast in a turbulent maelstrom of death. Clouds of arrows from the Imperial archers cut down the unleashed fanatics. Several fell among the main night goblin unit, throwing them into confusion and disarray. Magical energy made the air over the 2 armies shimmer and ripple. The tides of power made Azhag's skin tingle. Looking down, he saw a bright green glow surround Grimbog's head. Suddenly, with an enormous bang, the goblin shaman's head exploded, sending green brains splattering over the combatants surrounding him. The human warriors seemed to take heart and fight on with renewed fury. The entire battle hung in the balance. It actually seemed that through sheer courage and gobbo cowardice, the Humies might win. Excuse me. Azhag invoked the blade wind once more, sending the blades dancing down at the Elector Count himself. Before they could reach him, a brilliant golden glow surrounded the Imperial war banner. The shafts of light struck the dark magical blades, and the weapons faded like mist in morning sunlight. Azhag bellowed in frustration. Now he was just going to sort this out the old-fashioned way, by hand. Shrieking his battle cry, he sent the wyvern into a steep dive, catching the Reiksguard knights in the flank. The Count tugged on his horse's reins, forcing the terrified animal round to face the wyvern. For a moment, even the Reiksguard's iron discipline wavered. Attacked from the side by the enormous wyvern, their hearts quailed. Gor's renders took new heart at the sight of Azhag's charge and their foe's discomfiture. Gor swigged down his enchanted potion, and the muscles of his arms swelled with newfound monstrous strength. He bellowed out a cheerful greeting to Azhag. The Elector Count lashed out with the rune fang. Frantically, Azhag parried. The writhing of the wyvern and the rearing of the warhorse made any sort of skilled fencing impossible, and it was more a case of luck as to who hit who. Azhag bit back a howl of pain as the rune fang slashed his forearm. Pain seared up his arm, and he almost dropped his sword. Fighting back the agony, he lashed out at the Elector Count. His blade bit deep in return, cutting through the man's armor like a butcher's cleaver going through a piece of meat. The Elector was driven backwards by the sheer force of Azhag's blow. Meanwhile, the wyvern had reached forward with its long neck and caught a parted warhorse between its huge jaws. In an awesome display of incredible strength, it lifted the armored beast into the air, rider and all, then hurled the kicking and screaming creature to the ground with bone-breaking force. The shock of the impact and the weight of its armored rider broke the animal's back, killing it instantly. The trapped knight was chopped to bits by the resurgent orcs. Gor crashed through the melee like a demon of elemental fury. With one backhanded swing of his scimitar, he cut through the Count's standard and its bearer's arm. The severed limb flopped to the ground and twitched for a moment like a decapitated snake. It was all too much for the surviving knights. Forming up around the wounded Elector, they turned and retreated. Their horses enabled them to outdistance the orcs. Half blind with pain, Azhag tried to make the wyvern follow, but it was too busy slobbering down chunks of the dead warhorse. Azhag looked round blearily. In the distance, he could see half a dozen surviving Reiksguard infantry cut down nearly an entire regiment of forest goblins. The stunted one's nerve had broken, and they had turned to flee, presenting their backs to the Imperial soldiers. The close-packed mass of panicking gobos tried to flee in every direction, tripping over each other in their confusion and getting in each other's way. All the humans had to do was run among them, trampling them underfoot and hacking them in their undefended backs. In mere moments, most of the goblins were dead. The humans were chopping one down with every ill-aimed stroke. The greenskins were so close that the men couldn't miss. Azhag bellowed to Naga to sort it out. The orcs charged in. The grossly outnumbered humans prepared for their last stand. Azhag nearly allowed himself to slump in the saddle. The battle was almost won. The best of the human army was almost in full retreat. No, he decided he would not rest. Not when he had a blade in his hand and a fight before him. He dug his spurs into the wyvern's flanks, forcing the gorged creature to flap slowly into the air. There were still archers to slay, and warriors to cut down. Azhag looked down on the boy's body and tried to understand what had brought one so young, so far, only to be killed. He felt that if he could understand that, then he would understand his enemies and find final victory. Humans were not like his followers, he knew that. The crown had given him sufficient insight to see. Humans were not warlike in the same way as orcs. The big greenskins lived to fight. They might be momentarily overcome by panic in the heat of battle when all around was confusion, but death held no terrors for them. Orcs lived to fight and eat and to plunder. Azhag looked at his boys as they stomped around over the battlefield, rolling drunk on firewater, and chanting their victory songs till it seemed the heavens would shake. Tonight they had grasped victory. Tomorrow they would go in search of another. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry, that was probably loud. No. Humans were not like orcs. They feared to die. To an orc, death was something that just happened. A bit of bad luck, like breaking a tooth when you bit into stone bread. Death was not something an orc looked forward to with any apprehension. Orcs knew their lot was to fight and die. They complained about it no more than a tree complained about the wind and rain. Humans were not like that. They were weak. They sought things other than ceaseless warfare, and the prospect of death frightened them. Yet humans were not like goblins either. They were not sly, avaricious, cowardly little creatures who had to be bullied by a powerful leader or ensorcelled or drugged before they would face a foe in battle. Looking at the gobbos slinking round the orc warriors, sneakily stealing scraps of food and plunder, Azhag felt a surge of contempt. Goblins could be cruel and malicious, but they rarely overcame their fear. Azhag found it hard to imagine any goblin holding his ground unless they greatly outnumbered their foes. Goblins were not brave. The human had been brave, Azhag thought. He had known fear, and he had overcome it. He had held his ground in the face of certain death and tried to hold Azhag back while his wounded comrades fled. It had been a selfless thing to do, and all the more selfless because he had been afraid. Azhag shook his head. Such behavior was almost beyond his comprehension. Still, he had the time. The world was his to conquer. All around, the orcs sang their victory songs. As if unaware of all the death and disaster about them, they played like children in the wreckage of the battle. For a moment, Azhag felt alone. In all the screaming mob, he seemed the only one to have stopped and thought about the future. It was that which separated him from the rest. Well, that was probably a more dramatic reading than I was expecting. That was very cool, actually. I had a great time with that. So, knowing that that's there, I'm going to go back through the Wood Elf book and see if there's something similar, because they're both 5th edition books. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.